So, good afternoon. Welcome to another talk in the lecture series of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide and Memory Studies. I'm Alon Confino, the director of the Institute. I'm delighted to see you with us. And I'm delighted to have with us today Guy Beiner, who is a professor of modern history at Ben-Gurion University and currently, or just finished, being the visiting Burns Scholar at Boston College. It has been a very eventful year for him, coming here and encountering the corona. As you know, this summer, we are having a lecture series at the Institute about historical events, but also about contemporary events, particularly the two major events that have dominated our life in the last few months, which is the COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and calls for racial justice in America. In 2 weeks, we are going to have a talk by Michal Dekel entitled The Flight East, Holocaust Refugees in Tashkent, Tehran, and Tel Aviv, in which Michal will talk about her new book, Tehran Children, a Holocaust Refugee Odyssey, in which she tells the story of her father, who was a Holocaust child refugee in Tehran. Today, we have with us Guy Beiner. It's especially a pleasure for me to introduce him. He was my former colleague at Ben-Gurion University. Guy is a specialist in the history of remembering and forgetting, with a particular interest in Ireland. He's the author of 2 multiple prize-winning books. The first is Remembering the Year of the French, Irish Folk History and Social Memory, published in 2008. And the second one is the very recent Forgetful Remembrance, Social Forgetting and Vernacular Historiography of a Rebellion in Ulster, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2018. It has won 4 prizes. I'm not going to read you all the names. They are all very distinguished. And it received an honorable mention in the Times Literary Supplement Book of the Year list. Several years ago, Guy started to be interested in the Great Flu, in the Great Influenza of 1918-1919. Then it was a topic that has fallen off the sideway of history. Very few people wrote about it, explored it, remembered it, and Guy directed an international project to look at the remembrance of this event. When I talked to him a few days ago, I told him that presumably he knows not only the past, but he can predict the future. Even he didn't think that when his book will be in preparation as it is now, this co-edited book, the Great Flu will be much in demand, and we will all want to know much more about the Great Flu of 1918 and 1919 and think about it in relation to our own flu. So he's currently editing a collection of essays entitled Pandemic Reawakenings, the Forgotten and Unforgotten Great Flu of 1918-1919. And I think we all look forward to reading this book. His talk today is entitled Rediscovering the Forgotten and Unforgotten Influenza Pandemic of 1918-1919. At the end of his talk, we are going to have a Q&A. So please direct your questions in the chat to me, and I will direct the traffic. And the best way to see the talk is to choose speaker view on your Zoom. Guy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen with you, and hopefully we'll work with that. I prepared a PowerPoint. I hope everybody can see this presentation that I prepared. It's on a different monitor for me, but I'll just follow it here. Thank you very much for inviting me to attend this forum, and especially thank you to Alon and to Mepaz for putting this together. Alon is one of the great scholars of memory studies, one of the pioneering scholars, so it's a great honor to be here. And I'm going to delve right into the topic because I have a lot to say in a relatively short time. Had I given this talk just 4 months ago, I would have given it differently. I would have felt that I have an obligation to devote a good part of the talk. I don't see the best here. Let me just see if I can improve my vision. I'm sorry for that. I'm in the wrong mode here. If you can wait 1 second. Well, we'll leave it at that. I'm sorry. I put myself in a wrong mode. Had I given this talk a few months ago, I would have felt that I need to explain to you in much greater detail the historical reference. But I actually think now things have changed. And I think all of us are much more familiar now with the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919. And that's exactly part of the talk, this rediscovery of interest. So let's take a step at a time. I will review very briefly some key points in the history, in the medical history, in the social medical history of the pandemic itself, just so we all have a general idea of my historical reference. And following that, while I do that, I also put some stresses. I'll try and explain. So I'm having some technical difficulties here, but I should be fine in a minute. I'll try and explain or put some stresses on points which I think also affect the memory and forgetting of it. So let's begin with your permission. It was called famously the Spanish influenza, and that was a misnomer. At the time, some people believed that it originated in Spain and traveled around the world. You can even see how the nickname picked up. For example, here's the Times, the English Times on the 25th of June, 1918. Everybody thinks of it as the Spanish influenza today. And they're talking about the epidemic raging throughout the British Isles. And it's similar. The name appears in many different countries. Now, this is a misnomer. It's a misnomer which we can explain today to the best of our ability, most probably in the relative freedom of press in the early stages of the pandemic in neutral Spain. In neutral Spain, news of the pandemic, of the epidemic in Spain was advertised already during the month of May into June 1918, whereas the belligerent countries in World War I were much more cautious. They didn't mention it for many reasons, or they tried not to mention it in its early days, in its first days, because they thought it might damage the war effort. We have to be careful about that. There wasn't censorship, and the epidemic was widely reported in the press, but it wasn't played that in such a prominent way in its initial stages. And that's an interesting point. Incidentally, in Spain, of course, it wasn't called the Spanish influenza. In Spain, it was called the French influenza. They believed it came from France. Many different countries had other nicknames, blaming a country nearby or an ethnic group nearby. It's a game which we're quite familiar with in pandemics, including today. In Spain, the popular nickname for it was actually the Naples soldier, El Soldado de Nápoles. And that's from a song, a very popular song at the time, from a zarzuela, an operetta, called La Canción de Olvido, the Song of Forgetting, interestingly enough. So that's a nickname that was in Spain at the time. You'll see even images of it. At the time already it was known that this was not a Spanish flu. It didn't originate in Spain. It was widely advertised it didn't originate there, but for some reason this name stuck to it. So where did it originate from? Just briefly, well, there are a few theories about this, a few hypotheses. The most prominent are, and I'm just reviewing this briefly because it's not the main topic of my talk. I want to deal with how it's forgotten and remembered and rediscovered. But one of them is that it might have actually originated in the United States, in the Midwest. In Kansas, County Haskell, Kansas. From there spread to a neighboring military encampment, Fort Funston, which had thousands of troops, and from there maybe traveled across America and over across the Atlantic with the troops as the American forces were deployed in Europe. So that's one theory, heavily promoted in recent years by John Barry, but already has a history before that. Another theory which is quite prominent is that it might have originated in the battlefields of France and the Western Front. Possibly at Etaples, a military camp. There was an early outbreak in 1916 of epidemic influenza, and also in Aldershot, a British military camp in England. And so it might have traveled with the troops from Europe outside of there. That's another hypothesis. And another third is the ever popular place of the hotbed of epidemics throughout history, and that's of course China. So it could have originated in China, and it could have traveled with Chinese laborers to the west coast of the States and onto Europe, and that might have been another route. The interesting point, as I see it, about all three of these theses, is they're already in circulation at the time of the events themselves. Shortly after the war, there were publications. In 1927, there was a book by a virologist and epidemiologist by the name of Jordan, and he mentions these three theories and shows that they can't be proven. And 100 years later, we still don't really know. These are hypotheses. They say a lot about the historians who suggest this data and how they work with it, but they're completely inconclusive. And that's a point also to bear in mind as I go along here. I've had to do a lot of reading in medical history over the last few years with this project, and it's often presented in a very authoritative form. But we should be careful. In scientific literature, bold statements are made, but they don't always have full cover behind them. And keep that in mind as we go further. So a few other quick characteristics of it. It truly was a global pandemic. It spread rapidly around the globe, reaching every continent except for Antarctica. Hardly any places, barely no places were spared. I can think of a couple of islands in the Pacific were the exception to the rule. For example, American Samoa in the Western Pacific was spared because of a very tight quarantine. But just nearby, a neighboring island of Western Samoa, which was a New Zealand colony at the time, was completely devastated. Remote corners such as Bristol Bay, in Alaska, completely decimated. The Inuit communities, there's reports of stray dogs, packs of stray dogs eating corpses, of orphans being left alone because the parents died, particularly hardly hit. So it spreads rapidly around the world, and it's a fully global pandemic. We haven't fully traced all the roots of its spreading in terms of its history. In terms of its scale, and this is interesting, shortly after the war, the figure that was floated was above 20 million. And this was more or less an estimate which was put together by Edwin Oakes Jordan, the epidemiologist, who I mentioned before, who gives a figure of, and this is interesting also, look how science works here. He says, I can't give precise numbers, and gives a precise figure. 21,642,283 people died. 21.5 million, and it's a complete estimate. Some years later, the number kept going up. It kept going up specifically since in the 1980s, it was found that India was the hardest hit country in the world, the subcontinent of India, not a country, the whole subcontinent. And it's believed that up to 18.5 million may have died in India alone. So the figures had to be revised. And the figure that was floated in the early 90s was a conservative figure of 30 million, possibly up to 40 million. And the standard figure today, which goes back to 2002, to a kind of comprehensive survey which was done then, which needs to be rethought, I think, again now, is even more startling. It speaks of 50 million people dying around the world and adds this even more startling caveat. Even this vast figure may be substantially lower than the real toll, perhaps as much as 100% understated. Now, this figure is repeated again and again nowadays, that the flu killed 50 to 100 million, with great authority. But it seems to me to tell us a lot about the state of medical studies. We really don't know, do we? I mean, there's a huge difference. 50 million, 100 million? Can we just be in a cavalier way throw this? It actually says that we really have a lot to figure out what's happening here, but we know that the numbers were huge. And if we talk about it, in that sense, we can also talk about morbidity, because influenza, even much less than the epidemic we're experiencing at the moment, it was more widespread perhaps than the pandemic we're experiencing at the moment, but its death rate was lower. So its morbidity, the number of people sick, was even much higher. If we look at its morbidity, a standard figure often floated is 500 million people around the world were infected by influenza. That's suggested by Jeffrey Taubenberger and other virologists, but even that figure is problematic. Another figure, which is presented by an historian who looked at it a bit more comprehensively, Niall Jordan, suggested that the number should be 1 billion people, which is half the population of the world. And even then he adds that this may be an underestimate. So we're talking about this massive pandemic, which can be rightly called the greatest catastrophe in history. No other event killed and affected so many people in such a short duration of time. Even within the deadly 20th century, it stands out. A few more things I'll say about it, just to characterize the pandemic itself, so we don't just talk about it in terms of numbers and geography as we go along there. Let's look at its characteristics. It attacked in 3 waves, at least in 3 waves. An initial wave in the spring of 1918, which was a relatively mild wave, often referred to at the time as the 3-day fever. Comes and goes after 3 days, killed some people, but many people were hit, but not killed. Then it seems to subside and attacks again with great virulence, with lethal virulence, in the autumn of 1918. Sorry, that's the most deadly wave. And it returns again in early 1919. And today we're speaking more and more about a 4th wave in 1920, so it might recur again. It should actually be called the Great Influenza of 1918 till 1920. The reason I refer to it 1918 to 1919 is that's how it's preserved in historical consciousness, in memory. And I want to refer to memory. I'll get to it very shortly. Another irregularity of it, as opposed to almost all other pandemics that we're aware of. Usually, influenza pandemics, when they attack, or influenza in general, would be particularly dangerous for the very young and for the very old. So it would usually produce a U graph, as we see here. The very young and the very old would be hit badly. But the difference in 1918, 1919, 1920 was this W graph, which is replicated around the world, in which the age group of young adults, normally healthy young adults, in ages from 15 to 40 more or less, hit very badly. And that's irregular. And that's quite unique to this pandemic. It had extremely aggressive symptoms, much more than influenza. And influenza is much more than the common cold. But this was extremely irregular symptoms, perhaps most striking than anything else. If I have to show you one graphic illustration of its symptoms, would be this discoloration that was quite symptomatic. People's bodies filled with mucus, filled with liquids. People drowned in their own liquids, their lungs drowned. And blood supply, oxygen couldn't reach the periphery, couldn't reach any, even vital organs very, very shortly. These are pictures before people dying from the Lancet magazine of the time. And they have this heliotrope cyanosis, which was typical of many people who died from the Spanish influenza. Gave it a nickname among some doctors afterwards as the Purple Death. A few other quick characteristics. This suddenness. Sorry, I'm jumping forward. The suddenness, I'm going to show you here through caricatures, through popular culture, which is important, I think. So look at this caricature of suddenly this massive influenza attacking you when you're least ready for it. And accounts again and again of people who seem to be healthy in the morning, and by the evening they're dying, which is extremely aggressive. Another feature which we should think about, and this is from an Argentinian magazine, Caras y Caretas, and I'm trying to show you things from different places in the world. The feeling that there are no cures, no remedies. Medicine had nothing to offer. There was no vaccine. There was no way of actually dealing with it. People turned to a whole variety of folk medications, and various companies, pharmaceuticals, sold various medications which didn't really help. And this feeling of desperation. This is compounded with the feeling that the medical establishment didn't have anything to offer. This is a New Zealand caricature showing the Minister of Health peddling a whole range of various possible cures which are completely useless, including, by the way, disinfectant. Which goes to show how things can become relevant, but the public feeling that they have no one to turn to. And there's a reason for that. Modern medicine, which had promised to put an end to all these deadly diseases, was actually caught unaware. In terms of influenza, it didn't even know at the time that influenza was a virus. The influenza virus was only isolated in the early 1930s. So people were actually looking at the wrong thing. They thought it was a germ. They were looking at a bacillus called the Bacillus influenzae, the Pfeiffer bacillus, which was a red herring. So doctors had little to offer. And that maybe is the last point I'll say when referring to the last couple of points when referring to the history before moving on to this kind of forgetting and rediscovery. Look at this picture here. And I think this tells us a lot. The visual representation of the pandemic is remarkable. We have here a picture from an American military camp of a doctor instructing a nurse how to take care of a patient. Now, it's quite ironic because doctors had very little to offer. They had no medications and no real knowledge of what was happening. When you read their diaries at the time, they're completely desperate. Nurses, on the other hand, had a lot of help to offer. If the real heroes of that pandemic need to be identified, they'd be nurses, primarily women. It was all about gender balance, who were considered inferior in the hierarchy, in the medical hierarchy, to doctors. As one English doctor wrote, they fell like 9 pins. Many died and yet weren't quite recognized for that. And that also kind of reflects, I think, gender will be reflected afterwards in the story of forgetting. We might return to it in the Q&A. The last point, perhaps, this is a foundational moment in the history of public health. This is the moment where public health is really institutionalized. This moment in which the authorities realize, not only the medical authorities, the municipal authorities, the national authorities, they have to intervene. They have to guide the public. They have to explain to them terms which now we've become familiar with, of social distancing, of wearing masks, of staying at home, of not attending big events, even though there was constant political pressures to attend big events, not least to rally in support of the war, not least to collect money for the war, political rallies, political demonstrations. There was huge pressure, things which we can all identify now, which all seem all that relevant. Now, I briefly described just a few of the key points in the history, as I see it, of the pandemic, mainly to stress the point that by all standards, this was a major historical event, which affected millions upon millions of people across the globe and changed their lives completely. Now, we would like to believe that such an event will be recognized in historiography, will be recognized in memory. If so many people die, doesn't that mean that they will be remembered afterwards? And here we have the conundrum. So let's start with historiography very briefly. It's hard to explain this. These are all topics for a lecture in themselves, but where do we find this historiographical neglect? How did the historical establishment neglect this topic for decades? Very little published about it in the decades afterwards in terms of history books, always in the margins. Small books, slowly, and each time we find it's an exception to the rule. Perhaps the best way of illustrating that or demonstrating it is asking, when was the first international conference on the topic? And it's astounding. The first international conference on the topic was in 1998. 80 years after the pandemic. It's in Cape Town, South Africa, September 1998. People come from around the world, not only historians. It's a multidisciplinary conference which also looks at the medical aspects of it and various other aspects. 12 sessions, 36 papers, breaking new ground in every way. 5 years later, a volume comes out with just 16 chapters. Many of those papers haven't even been published, which is interesting in itself. There was interest, but limited interest. But this will start a wave of interest. And in years afterwards, we'll see an increasing number of publications, both by professional historians and by public historians, or those who cater for a wider public. For example, just shortly afterwards, John Barry's book, The Great Influenza, which was a New York Times bestseller, comes out again in 2005 in a new edition. So this is starting a whole new wave of interest, which I'll get into. However, and what I'd like to show at this point is, how do we explain this neglect, this oversight? And one way of thinking about it might be by looking at one of the people who actually tried to popularize it a few years earlier, a popular science writer, Gina Kolata. She still writes for the New York Times, very interesting woman, a science writer. And it's interesting to go and revisit a book which was a bestseller in its time, a New York Times bestseller, comes out in 1999, issued again with a wave of renewed interest in 2005. And it's interesting to think of her preface. So in her preface, she begins like this. I'm just going to quote her because I think it tells an interesting story. If anyone should have known about the 1918 flu, it was I. I was a microbiology major in college and even took a course in virology, but the 1918 flu was never mentioned. I also took history courses in college, one of my favorites being a class that covered the important events of the 20th century. But although World War I was a major part of the course, the 1918 flu was not discussed. I've written about diseases and medicine for my entire career, first at Science magazine and then at the New York Times, even writing articles about influenza. But I never paid any attention to the 1918 flu. So here we have somebody who's not just a member of the public, she's an expert. She grew up in the world of science, didn't encounter it in college at all. Didn't encounter it in history at college at all. And she had to think about this. Now, we might say the reason for that is it didn't affect her own family. It's not true. It's quite remarkable. The 1918 flu even affected my family and my husband's family. She goes on to explain that her husband's family had changed the whole history of their family. The husband's grandfather died, and the mother had to raise the children alone. It was a terrible experience which affected their lives in every way. So she had this experience with her husband, her own family had stories of it, and yet she says, it seems remarkable to me now that I never grasped the fact that a terrible epidemic had swept the world in 1918, leaving death and devastation in its wake, and touching nearly every family with its icy hand. The 1918 influenza epidemic is one of history's greatest conundrums, obliterated from the consciousness of historians. Now that's a strong indictment. And we have to try and understand what's happening here. So let's look at historians a bit, with your permission. And I'm going to say that in terms of historiography, and maybe more generally in the history of memory, a field that Professor Confino knows far better than myself, I believe, one could argue that the Great Flu was overshadowed by the Great War. The Great War, which of course in European discourse is reference to World War I, not World War II. And the Great War, which in many ways founds much of the 20th century memorial culture. It precedes World War II. We often think that the memorial culture that we experience today is born out of World War II, but much of it originates in World War I. And if we think, and on purpose, I'm showing here this image of one of the great World War I cemeteries, but the military cemetery, the notion that already America had from its Civil War, that the democratization of memory, every person has a name, we remember everybody. We could argue that this massive culture of memorialization and commemoration overshadows the Great Flu. It doesn't leave any space for the Great Flu. And how does that affect historiography? Well, let's give a good example of one of, I think, the greatest historians of memory of World War I. And this would be Jay Winter. And I'm looking at one of his classic books here, Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning. A classic book that comes out in 1995, reissued in multiple editions afterwards. A book which really maps out how we deal with memory in a transnational way throughout Europe, with the memory of the Great War and afterwards with many other events. And it's interesting, when Jay Winter, who in a way is responsible for a key player in the memory boom, when we come to the memory of wars in the 20th century and events in the 20th century, when he opens his book, and if you go and reread it, it's quite striking. It always struck me as a student when I read this section. He opens with the story of the death of Guillaume Apollinaire, the famous surrealist poet. He calls this section the death of a poet. Here's Guillaume Apollinaire in the famous sketch by Picasso. He was a friend of Picasso. And the story of Apollinaire is remarkable. I'll just describe it briefly because it's not my main point, but this is how Winter describes it. Pity is a word appropriate to the circumstances of Apollinaire's death. This great poet who volunteers for the army, he's not conscripted, he volunteers, he's a Polish citizen who came to Paris, goes to the Western Front, survives the horrors of the Western Front, is hit by a shell and has head injuries. He should have died in the Western Front. He's operated on in the Western Front. He goes through trepanning and he survives. And then he returns home on vacation in the autumn of 1918, just before the ceasefire. And he sits with friends, and he seems healthy. And the next day, his friend Blaise Sandrel, famous writer of the time, comes to meet him, and the porter says, no, he's not feeling well, come a bit later. And by the evening, he's dead. They have to go to Montparnasse to look for the grave. He dies almost instantly. There's this kind of pithy description of the gravedigger. They're running around the friends looking for where the funeral has happened because they came late and they can't find it because the undertaker says, you understand, with the flu, with the war, they don't tell us the names of the dead. We put them in the ground. There are too many. So the dead of the flu are mingled with the dead of the war. Apollinaire will later be remembered as a war hero, not as a flu victim. This story seems to tell it all in many ways, but it also tells us something historiographically, because that is the only reference to Spanish flu in this great book of Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning by Jay Winter. He goes on then to describe the war. He begins with a description of the flu, but it's also subsumed in his own account. So if we continue with his own accounts, we'll see his later work, and he's written brilliant works. Remembering War, the great war between historical memory and history in the 20th century. More recently, War Beyond Words, not mentioned at all, the flu. Now, this has changed. In his most recent, he's edited the Cambridge history, the new Cambridge history of World War I. Now there's a chapter on the Spanish flu. More and more there's awareness of it. He's writing a preface to the volume that I'm putting together. So I think things have changed. But the fact that for years, histories of World War I didn't mention the flu, even though it changed in many ways the outcome of World War I or affected it in different ways, is startling. Even in a larger scope, it seems to have been overshadowed. So that's part of the story, I believe, that we're trying to follow here. We could argue that if the Great War was a lieu de mémoire, or perhaps in the plural, a collection of lieux de mémoire. And of course, here I'm referring to Pierre Nora, which we have to refer to when we talk about lieux de mémoire and sites of memory. If this is a locus classicus of sites of memory in European and international culture, then perhaps we should think of the Great Flu as a lieu d'oubli. And we should be thinking, and I think about more and more in all of my works and various projects about this notion of sites of forgetting and what does that mean. And that's what I'm going to share with you now in the little time I have now, what I actually mean by forgetting, because it's not what we think it is. So, are there monuments to the flu? Well, that's what's striking, perhaps, beyond anything else. When we look around, unlike the Great War, there are no monuments to the flu, there are no museums to the flu, there are no heritage sites to the flu, there's not a stamp to the flu, all the signs that we associate with commemoration. And of course, people will come up and say, well, there's always exceptions. I'll find you an exception. Here's a good example by Mark Honigsbaum, who's a terrific historian of pandemics and epidemics, and has written remarkable work. And he points out, for example, that you can find a memorial. In the medical library at the Royal London Hospital, if you look very carefully, you'll find a window. And in that window, there's a memorial window to the flu. There's no contextual information about that. The person at the desk up until recently couldn't tell you what it is, that window that's there. It's not all that late, it's fairly recent, by the way, and nobody knows about it. So in many ways, what we see here is the exception that proves the rule. Whenever we find such a case, it shows how few memorials there are. I can find a few others and I can point to places, but it's not in our awareness. Essentially, this is again what I mean by sites of forgetting, that they're not part of public remembrance. And we need to look even more at what we mean by that. So let's keep going here with the picture. And a good place to start our exploration would be with Alfred Crosby. For those who are not familiar with Alfred Crosby, one of the truly great historians of the 20th century, an environmental historian, passed away recently. Really remarkable man, wrote incredible books, but for our point of view, I'm not going to look at his environmental histories, but at his pioneering book. In 1976, Alfred Crosby writes a book called Epidemic and Peace, which is a history of the pandemic, mainly in America. And it'll be reissued in 1989 with a new title, America's Forgotten Pandemic, and reissued again in 2003, America's Forgotten Pandemic. Observe the title, by the way. When he writes this history in 1976, as I see it, he had to push his thesis a bit too much in order to get legitimization to his field of inquiry. There was no interest in publishing a book on Spanish flu. There's much interest in many other topics, including another book on the war maybe, but not on Spanish flu. So the last part of his book is an interesting hypothesis, which makes sense to a degree, to a limited degree. We have to qualify it, where he says the whole outcome of World War I was determined by Spanish flu, and specifically he looks at the Versailles Treaty. He says the fact that Woodrow Wilson was sick at the Paris talks means that he was weak, therefore French revanchism was given free rein, therefore Germany was faced with full responsibility, therefore this determines the whole outcome of the 20th century. Now it's pushing his thesis a bit, and you can see the title, Epidemic and Peace, is a Tolstoyan title, right? It's a paraphrase, it's War and Peace. And it shows how much he had to maybe put effort to market this book. The thesis itself can be examined in its own right, but look how in 1989 he changes his language. He talks about the forgotten pandemic. There's a new language there. And very interestingly, he has an afterword at the end of the book, an inquiry into the peculiarities of human memory. Looking at this event, he realizes it poses puzzles. So let's look at how he approached it briefly, because it's a great starting point, and he raises key questions. The important, almost incomprehensible fact about Spanish influenza is that it killed millions upon millions of people in a year or less. And yet, I'm skipping here, it never inspired awe. Not in 1918 and not since, not among the citizens of any particular land and not among the citizens of the United States. This inaptitude for wonder and fear cannot be attributed to a lack of information. As an historian, he goes there, he says the information is everywhere. But it didn't inspire awe. How do we explain that? And he tried to explain it in his own way. And I think these are key points, which have been repeated afterwards by many other people. We could add a few, but just kind of the immediate reasons why we might understand why it was forgotten. One, he says, just because the fact that it was influenza, and Spanish influenza in particular, this kind of quick disease that came and went and never returned again in the same form. Maybe that's one of the reasons why it was forgotten. It came and went, people recovered from it, moved on. Possibly an influenza in itself didn't seem to be, it seemed kind of very transient. So transience might be part of the story. Another case would be that flu in general is not lodged in folk memory. I'm willing to contest that, but it's not like other diseases which seem to kind of haunt us in folk memory. it came and went. He says it had an enormous influence, but one that utterly evades logical analysis and completely ignored by all commentators of the past. I'll return to these points shortly and what he means by that. And just to throw some other reasons, or before throwing some other reasons, well, before that, he also said he didn't kill any famous people. We also realize now that it did, but we can argue that. We can look at these points, and we can look at other points that have been suggested why it's been forgotten. And there's various points, and I'm willing to contest each of these points because none of them determine that it had to be forgotten. It's not that pandemics are necessarily forgotten. The Black Death of the Middle Ages was remembered for centuries. It was not forgotten. It's not that pandemics inevitably are forgotten. It's not that epidemics, you could say, can be politicized. That's not true either. You can also politicize an epidemic and remember it through politics. Look at the AIDS epidemic. If there's a group which has a vested interest in politicizing it, perhaps. Here it didn't work for this global pandemic. But the point that I think we should ask ourselves is not so much why it was forgotten, because that's speculative, but how it was forgotten. What do we mean by how it was forgotten? That's a more interesting point to ask as historians. And here, we should again return to Cosby for one last moment here, before we say goodbye to him. He points to this mystery and paradox. It was barely noticed, and people didn't recall. It was obvious to anyone examining the histories, popular magazines, newspapers, and political military memoirs of the war. However, if one turns to intimate accounts, to reminiscences, to letters, to oral histories, we realize that people did notice it. That people remembered the pandemic quite clearly and often acknowledge it as one of the most influential experiences of their lives. And here, I can show you quite clearly how it was remembered. This is not just speculation, because another interesting figure is a man called Richard Collier. Richard Collier was a private historian, an independent, amateur historian, if you wish. He wasn't affiliated with any university. He wrote popular history books among various events, largely forgotten today, wrote about D-Day, wrote about different events, popular history books. And through that, he learned the value of using oral testimonies. And in the early 1970s, he decided he's writing a book about Spanish flu. And the way he approached it, completely self-funded, he placed ads in newspapers around the world and asked if anybody has any stories I'd be interested to hear. And he was inundated with responses. He had to hire translators around the world to translate and collect this material for him. And altogether, he collected, in his archive, you can find 1,770 testimonies from 29 countries around the world, mostly from survivors and a few cases from the children of survivors. And this he published in a book called The Plague of the Spanish Lady in 1974. This is the American edition, this is the international edition, republished in 1996. And it shows without shadow of a doubt the persistence of individual memories and family traditions around the world as private memories. And if that's not enough, this inspired other people when it came out. Again, this is at the margins of historiography. So look at this. A young historian at the time, all around these people now, they're contributing chapters to my book now, so I know them quite well. A young historian at the time, a PhD student in South Africa, Howard Phillips, is inspired by Richard Collier's work and goes collecting oral testimonies in South Africa. He collects interviews from 150 different people, which he weaves into his PhD. Another young historian at the time, also retired at the moment now, is Jeffrey Rice. He collects 110 testimonies from survivors. Interesting. In terms of historiography, their testimonies were only published 2 years ago. There was no interest in publishing it as a book for years, for 30 years. And that says a lot about this indictment. There were no big oral history and testimonies collecting testimonies from survivors as long as they were still alive. In newspapers in recent weeks, we've heard of the last people still alive. But when many people were still alive, there were no projects instigated, unlike survivors of World War I, the Holocaust, World War II, the Gulag, many other cases in history, modern history. Now, I want to explain this by introducing a term very briefly, and that's social forgetting, which is a term I use in my work quite a lot. And it's important to understand this. With social forgetting, I do not mean collective amnesia. I don't even like the word collective. I don't like the word collective memory. I think it's overrated. It can be used only in very specific contexts, but I definitely don't accept collective forgetting or collective amnesia, as if the whole of society forgets as a whole. I also don't see it as total oblivion or total forgetting. It's not that people don't forget historical events. On the contrary, most of history is forgotten completely, and we don't know anything about it. Most of the events in history have been completely forgotten. But that, as an historian, I have little to say about because it's completely been forgotten. There's no records of it. What I mean by social forgetting is events which were not fully forgotten. And I'll explain. It's the tension between public silence, public reticence, and private local recollections that are maintained, communities that maintain a local memory, families that maintain a local memory, but don't have a context in which to put it in collectively. And if we continue, we can think of it as an oblique form of social remembrance. A form of social remembrance that in a way sustains remembrance below the radar. Think of the pioneering work of the sociologist, Maurice Alvach, the man who coined the term collective memory, even though I think he really meant social memory, and he often in his writings refers to it as social memory. He was a sociologist who said that to maintain our memories, we need social frameworks. Well, here the social frameworks were lacking. People might have memories in their family, but there was no public context in which to share it, to maintain it, to preserve it, to bring it out. So it's the maintenance of memory below the radar without formal commemoration. And that's a characteristic of social forgetting as I see it, this tension. It's not complete forgetting. It's this tension between public oblivion and this private local commemoration or remembrance. Keep that in your mind, we'll return to it. The other point I want to talk about is, was it capable to talk about it? Could it be narrated, this pandemic? Somebody might say it's not narrativable, if there's such a word. So let's think about this in an interesting way. There's many ways of approaching it. It would be actually by looking at it through the great Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf wrote an essay in 1930 on being ill, later published in 1947 and reworked a bit. And as an author, she says, novels one would have thought would have been devoted to influenza and to disease. But it doesn't work. There isn't a story in it. The public's not interested in it. The public would say that a novel devoted to influenza lacked plot. They would complain that there was no love in it. Finally, to hinder the description of illness in literature, there's a poverty of language. We don't have the language to describe it. This is interesting. Virginia Woolf suffered from influenza several times in her life. She was also hit by the second wave of the Spanish influenza and by the third wave. She saw many people die around her. She was acutely aware of it. And in fact, if you reread some of her work, most prominently, Mrs. Dalloway, as recently done by a very interesting literary critic, Elizabeth Utka, in a book that just came out recently of rereading classic modernist works and finding influenza, the Spanish influenza in it, she shows us that Mrs. Dalloway herself was a survivor of the flu. We think of this book as Memory of World War I. It's actually about forgetting and remembering, in many ways, Spanish flu. So this is interesting. And this is the second concept I want to throw in you quickly. How do we deal with this dearth of what appears to be cultural memory of the great flu, especially with the lost generation, which wrote so much, this classic generation? Well, when we look, we can find the flu in different places, most prominently in the work of Catherine Ann Porter. It's a novella which some of you might know, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, a remarkable novella, more than a short story, not quite a novel, about her own experiences going through the Spanish flu, well worth reading. I really suggest that those who are not familiar with it, it's a classic in its own right. And then we have to think who else wrote about Spanish flu, who experienced it. Well, if we look carefully, we can find names. John Dos Passos, an important name of the lost generation. In Three Soldiers in 1921, he mentions it briefly. In 1919, which is part of a trilogy, it appears again very briefly. Willa Cather, who won the Pulitzer Prize for her book, One of Ours, in 1922, has a section on Spanish flu of soldiers traveling to France. Writers who were children at the time brought it in some of their works. Thomas Wolfe and William Maxwell were both children who were affected badly. In one case, the brother was killed. In another case, the mother and sibling died of Spanish flu, and they write novels about it. Mary McCarthy, in Memories of a Catholic Childhood, will later recount her story of growing up when her parents died of Spanish flu and growing up as an orphan. We could still ask, where are the great writers of the lost generation in all this line? Even here, if you scrape below the surface, you'll find surprises. Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway was an ambulance driver, a volunteer ambulance driver in Italy. He experienced the great flu firsthand. It's not in his great novels. And yet, if you look carefully, you'll find its reference in A Natural History of the Dead, which just appears as a line. The only natural death I've ever seen, outside of loss of blood, which isn't bad, was death from Spanish influenza. And he gives a graphic, very short description of Spanish influenza. But this is the point. None of these were the canonical works. When you look at the canon of cultural literature, of cultural memory, none of these works appear in it. So there is a memory, but it's not a prominent memory. It's there and it's not there. And that, I think, is what is the marker of what I call cultural forgetting. Let me give you just another example to explain this point. Let's look at it through artist, visual memory. We think of the great art of the 20th century. Where's Spanish flu in it? Can it even be depicted? Well, again, if we scrape below the surface, we'll find that some of the great artists did respond to it, obliquely perhaps. John Singer Sargent, American artist, travels to England, is one of the great artists of World War I, among other cases, has this picture of the interior of a hospital tent, which was actually a tent of influenza patients. And the color scheme is significant, apparently. These are people recovering, these are people dying of Spanish flu. Though you don't really see any markers of Spanish flu beyond that. Egon Schiele, the great Egon Schiele, his wife dies in the second wave, his pregnant wife with an unborn baby, and he dies shortly afterwards. And before he dies, he paints this picture of the family, envisioning the family which never lives. It's a family picture of a family which dies of the unborn child as if it happened, as if they had survived the flu. Edvard Munch, the great Norwegian painter. It's not fully clear if he really suffered from Spanish flu, but he has two self-portraits of himself after the Spanish flu, and here he is recovering from it. And yet, these are not the great works associated with these artists. If you think of Schiele, if you think of Munch, these are not the pictures. This is not the scream. These are not the great icons of the 20th century. It again is not the canonical works. And this brings us towards a definition of cultural forgetting. Cultural forgetting, again, is not total forgetting. It's the exclusion from the canon. It's memory below the radar, outside of cultural memory. It's a problem I've had again and again with scholars of cultural memory who think that if they find an obscure book, that signifies memory. No, it signifies forgetting. If a book hasn't been read by anybody, it means something. If a painting isn't acknowledged by people, it means something. It's an oblique form of memory, which is cultural forgetting. And that's the second point we can learn here, a larger point from the Great Flu. And if we want to find the memory, we need to look at popular depictions of it. For example, look at these striking caricatures from the time. And I'm looking here on purpose at German works. I want to expose you from works from different places in the world. German works of the Spanish Krankheit, of the Spanish disease, or the Schwarze Tod, the Black Disease, the Black Death, which echoes, of course, a previous Black Death. Or even this caricature here, this work of art by Alfred Kubin. Had we seen this from the early modern period, you would have said this is one of the great works of Albert Dürer. But because it's a Spanish flu, it's not in the canon. It's omitted. So again, this tension that we have there, which we've got to deal with. Moving quickly on, because my time is running out, I still want to make some important points of how we approach this as historians. If we follow Jan Assmann, and I'm following the great names of memory studies, if we follow Jan Assmann, who made the point that just as social and cultural memory has a history, what he called mnemohistory, our job as historians is to trace the history of memory throughout time, of cultural memory and social memory. There's a whole collection of mnemohistory of Marek Tam, which came out a few years ago. It's one of the buzzwords perhaps in memory studies. I would argue that what cases like the Great Flu challenge us with is with a Lethe history, to do a social and cultural history of forgetting, of the social and cultural forgetting that I've introduced now, this tension between public silence and private recollections, between the canon and things that are outside the canon. That's a whole Lethe history which needs to be done. And if we do it, one thing I want you to keep in mind, that we have to be very careful about standard psychological conceptions of forgetting. Because the standard notion, which is very misleading, is the forgetting curve. Hermann Ebbinghaus, a famous German psychologist, pioneer of memory studies, published in 1885 a famous study of forgetting. He did these nonsense syllables on himself and tried to remember. It took how long it would take him to forget these things that he memorized. And through that, he came with the forgetting curve, which still appears in standard books of psychology of on the topic of remembering and forgetting. So immediately after an event, we forget a lot, and then memory decreases until it's completely lost. The more we move away from the event, it seems to be intuitive, right? You know, it seems to us to be, that's how it works, right? We move away from an event, we forget it completely. That's not how historical memory works. It's not how social memory works. That's how cultural memory works. I don't need to tell that to people in Institute on Genocide and Holocaust Studies, because you could easily argue that there's much more cultural memory of the Shoah now than there was in 1950. Because we regenerate memory all the time. And when it comes to forgetting, we have to realize that social and cultural forgetting can be countered by rediscovery, by reawakened interest. And that's the last part of what I have to say very quickly. I want to quickly touch on the historical context for rediscoveries, very briefly. Do I still have another 5-6 minutes, Alon? So let's run with this very briefly. The context for popular rediscovery, and I'm doing this very schematically, it's much more complicated. I'd say, first of all, are recurring pandemics. Each time there was a recurring pandemic, you can note a moment of renewed interest in Spanish flu. And here's an interesting case. There's a little book, quite forgotten now, by Charles Graves. Interesting who Charles Graves was. He was the brother of Robert Graves, the great poet, who was a famous poet of World War I, who was famous for his poetry in World War I. Robert Graves was also sick with Spanish flu. Doesn't appear in his poetry, cultural forgetting. Now we'll go to Charles Graves. Charles Graves writes this popular book. He wrote a popular history of Spanish flu called Invasion by Virus, asking, can it happen again? And he writes it in the 1950s. And it's about to be published. And then in 1957, 1958, there's a pandemic of influenza, the Hong Kong, or the Asian flu, it's called. And his publishers suppress the publication, say, this is too frightening. We don't want this book coming out. So he sits on it. And then in 1968, 69, there's another pandemic, the so-called Hong Kong flu. And then the publishers are looking for something. There's suddenly a demand for historical precedents. How do we deal with this? And they published the book in 1969. So that's quite interesting. That's an interesting case. And if we look at this boom of interest in the early 2000s, we can see that it coincides more or less with the SARS epidemic of 2002, 2003, with the constant avian flu pandemic alerts of the 2000s, leading up to the swine flu pandemic of 2009, 2010, the so-called Mexican flu it was called for a while. The fear of future pandemics spurs on interest, historical interest in the memory of Spanish flu. And here, I would just add an observation, which we might come to in the questions and answers, which troubles me a lot, is it also influences the way the history is written, because then history is written as a cautionary tale. History is conscripted to say we need to study the Spanish flu because this might happen again. And this is quite unusual in historical studies. We don't necessarily study events because they will happen in the same way again. But this is how almost every book that comes out on Spanish flu in the 2000s always has a chapter in the end saying you need this because it's going to happen again. I'll return to that shortly. I want to show a couple of other quick contexts of rediscovery. Scientific fascination. Medical memory, which is another whole section of the book which I'm working on now, which is crucial. There's a whole medical memory. In the years immediately after the pandemic, there's a lot of embarrassment among doctors because they had no cure. But this spurred on scientists, biomedical scientists, to try and find a cure, to try and understand what influenza is. And this began a race to crack what this influenza was. And it's a fascinating story. And this medical memory, which was often within doors, within scientists, breaks out because it becomes more and more dramatic. Towards the millennium, the genome is sequenced. Towards the turn of the millennium. It's a remarkable adventurous story. If you want in a Q&A, I can respond to it. It's a whole story in itself, how the adventurous Johann Hulting goes to Breivik mission in Alaska and finds tissues from buried Eskimos. He had done this already in the 1970s and failed, does it again in the 1990s, brings it to Jeffrey Taubenberger and Anne Reid, and they managed to sequence it. And when news of that breaks out in the popular press, this brings in renewed interest. And of course, another major context for rediscovery. Centennial events. Anniversaries are always huge events. So the centenary. Just a couple of years ago, there was the centenary of 2018, 2019. For anybody who was paying attention, new books came out, most prominently Laura Spinney's Pale Rider, named after, of course, the famous book by Catherine Ann Porter. Translated to many languages, was a huge bestseller. If anybody wants to read a great read on Spanish flu, many academic books come out, a few exhibitions in the world, a few conferences. This picture is from an exhibition in London at the Florence Nightingale Museum. And yet, I would argue that this just scratched the surface. It never came to full popular awareness till now. To recurring pandemic, and that is our present context, which I'm going to end now, COVID-19. And we have to understand briefly, what's the connection between COVID-19 and Spanish influenza? Bear with me a little bit longer now, because this is quite remarkable. Let's just ask a question first of all. We'd like to believe that there's a logical sequence, that there's the event, history, then we remember it, and then we forget it. That's how we tend to approach memory. Anybody who does memory studies knows it's much more complicated. Read the works of Alon, Confino, you'll see it yourself. Memory and history are tied in each other from the very beginning. But I'm going to propose something more radical, which I've been proposing in my work for a few years now. That memory might begin before history. We might remember an event before it happens. And what do I mean by that? It's what the pioneering psychologist of memory, experiential psychologist, wrote in the 1930s already. Sir Frederick Bartlett talked about memory schemata. When we remember an event, in order for it to be able to understand it, when we encounter an event and try to remember it for the first time, we have to slot it into scenarios that are familiar for us before. We look at our memories of previous events in order to make sense of it. So in many ways, our memories are influenced by memories of earlier events, by pre-memories. Now, it will take me a while to demonstrate this. I can demonstrate this about many historical events. But what is the pre-memory of Spanish flu? Well, the pre-memory of Spanish flu, what was the Russian flu. There was a huge pandemic that was still within living memory at the fin de siècle in 1889, 1890, a massive pandemic of influenza around the world. And people remembered that. They had notions of that when it was happening. But oddly enough, I also think that it was what I call a different phenomenon, a related phenomenon. It was not only pre-memory, it was also pre-forgetting, because people had moved on from the Russian flu. It was the fin de siècle. They expected a new century. They expected medicine to bring answers to everything. They were afraid of big wars that would happen, and World War I happened. So in a way, it often also offered a schemata how to forget a big epidemic. And so my final comment is, what happens now? So COVID breaks out, and it spreads around the world. And if you do a Google search and check trends, for most of history, I could go back, this is just the past year, but we can go much further. If we go back, most of the time, nobody searches in Google Spanish flu. Very few people. It's a connoisseur interest. But then, look around here. Want to see the new wave of interest? Like the wave of COVID in March 2020, 3 months ago, boom, everybody's looking for Spanish flu to understand COVID, and it's around the world it happens. And that's the pre-memory of Spanish influenza. And my last comment is, this relates to all the rediscovery we saw in the 2000s. Because had you done a Google search in early 2000s, which I was doing as a student all the time, you would have found very little imagery on the web, very little material. But now we're inundated with it. Popular culture has absorbed all this new rediscovery. So it is all available for us now. And that's the connection between pre-memory, social forgetting, cultural forgetting, and rediscovering. I'll leave it at that, Alon.
Thank you, Guy. It was brilliant, really interesting, and the material is amazing. So let me start with a question that I was asked. And then I have a few questions, and please send me your questions. So someone asked, and you dealt with it a little bit in the last part, but maybe you can expand on it. How has the Spanish influenza re-emerged now in the discourse around COVID-19? How has it been used, and what can we learn from it about memory and pandemics in relation to COVID? Or is it too early to tell?
Well, it's a great question. In many ways, it is too early to tell, but we need to think about it. So there's been a huge wave of rediscovery, and any historian who knows anything about Spanish flu has been inundated in the last 3 months with requests. Now, I know this because I'm chasing 20 authors who've just submitted now all their chapters, but should have submitted them in March for this book that I'm editing, their final versions, because they didn't have a moment to rest. In between being in lockdown and having to teach online and having to face the difficulties, they've been giving interviews nonstop. Of course, it's too early to tell in many ways about how it influences COVID, but the big question people are obsessed with, I mean, you had a lecture about that just 2 weeks ago at your institute, how people remember COVID.
Exactly.
And people are looking at what happened in 1918, 1919. So there's a huge obsession. People are drawing lessons from it and thinking about drawing lessons from it. And that's instructive memory in many, many ways. And I think there are many lessons to be learned. Again, that's instrumental uses of memory. So we have to be very careful. It's very interesting for me how it's being used instrumentally and what that means for historical research, which is also slightly problematic, what it means for a history of memory. People are extremely anxious. I think beyond anything else, there's a huge anxiety of, will COVID be remembered? It's a phenomena, by the way, that I have observed in many other cases. It's a phenomena that I call pre-forgetting, which relates to what I was talking about before, the anxiety of forgetting an event. We're so afraid of it that we try to document it as much as we can. We're afraid that we'll lose it. And what people haven't come to terms with yet, people are learning about the history of Spanish flu, but people have yet to come to terms with its problematic forgetting. We have a very problematic history of not talking about Spanish flu for most of a century. What can we learn from that? That is where I'm at the moment. So that's just touching on it.
So I'd like to ask you a few questions. You presented really a fascinating analysis of how it was forgotten and how it was not really forgotten, but forgotten by some, but existing in all sorts of places in our culture. And then a very fascinating methodological points on how we should remember, how we scholars should analyze forgetting. So let me ask you a few things here. So I was wondering if the pandemic of this flu was not remembered also because there wasn't the language, or there wasn't quite the language to remember this sort of everyday life victimhood. Mm-hmm. I mean, one can understand why a nation, a state, or a society would remember the fallen soldiers of the First World War. It's heroic. It's about the nation, about patriotism. But how do you remember something that is not heroic, something that needs to look at yourself and your society in a different ways? Certainly the state, the ministries of health, the governments did not have any interest to remember the pandemic. For this, you need to have really a movement from below. So my question is whether there is also a shift over the century, that public remembrance by people is much more legitimate, that victimhoods also of people that are not heroic, AIDS victims, rape victims, victims of racism. And this brings me to the second point. What I got from your talk is that historians forgot it, but people sometimes forgot it, but sometimes not. It reminded me a little bit of the forgetfulness, quote unquote, of the rape of millions of German women from 1945 to 1944 to 1945 by the Russians, but also by the Allied forces and the Americans. And for decades, it was a non-subject. We can understand why the Russians and the Americans didn't speak about it, but also the Germans. And then, of course, it became legitimate. So what I want to say is that with the democratization of history of everyday life, history of the subaltern, history of women, history of subjects that the nation considered unimportant and unheroic, we come to remember things like the pandemic or other things. So just if you can think about this.
I think, Alon, you're touching on key points in memory studies. It's no surprise because you're well aware of memory studies and you know where it's at. But there's a few points we need to mention here. Well, first of all, I am presenting a new agenda for memory studies. I want to be very clear about it. It's not only in this, it's in all of my projects in recent years. I believe we need to move on from collective memory studies and look much more at social forgetting, which I think is a widespread phenomenon of historians neglecting things which were remembered under the surface, and of cultural forgetting. We need to be much more sophisticated in our work, and I think there's whole new agendas for memory studies, including in your institute, and including the examples that you gave below. The last chapter of my book is all about comparative examples, including the rape of women in the liberation, so-called liberation of Europe, what happens in the margins, or not the margins. So I give these examples, and I think this is a whole new agenda that we have to face. But there's a few things we need to look at here, historically. note, first of all, just starting by your last point, saying we've now developed a new sensitivity to victims and history from below and subaltern history. You threw a lot of big words. When did this happen historically? It didn't happen this year. We already have a few decades, this new awareness. History from below is part of the story of the 20th century, at least from the 1930s, at least. From 1945 onwards, the major paradigm is looking at history of victims, not of victors. So this story has been growing more and more and more. So juxtapose things that were remembered to the flu. The flu still stands out in this whole story. It's still a belated story. It's a massive catastrophe, but compared to many other events, it still doesn't fit in. Now, when you talk about everyday life, there's even a whole school, of course, of history of everyday life. But even then, it didn't pick up on the flu. So there's events that even allude that. And there's many reasons for that. And it's not just why. We have to follow how it happens. So, for example, the contributor to my book from Poland points out that in Eastern Europe, not only were new countries being formed, in Russia, you want to see a great case, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, and this is a different chapter in the book, the Soviet Union was badly hit, but we don't know. There's hardly been very little information about what happened in the Soviet Union because there was the Russian Revolution and then the Civil War, and they were dealing with other issues. It was overshadowed. But also throughout Eastern Europe, there were many other pandemics at the time, most notably typhus. Now, typhus was an epidemic that could be politicized. You could explain to the public how you beat typhus. You could identify the enemy. You could find lice and you could deal with it. But this overshadowed the memory of influenza, which was embarrassing. So there's many kind of micro stories, not micro kind of stories happening there of things competing against each other, which can be politicized. You can politicize a pandemic or an epidemic, but you need to have interest to do it. In Ireland, there was a small attempt to kind of blame, by Republicans, to blame the British for the death of Republican prisoners, but you couldn't blame the pandemic on the world on that, right? In Switzerland, there was an interesting attempt to try and politicize it and make heroes of the people who died in the epidemic. Quite interesting in the military. So in a neutral country, the military, they were looking for heroes of their own and they had to find. In other cases, it didn't pick up. So it's a complicated story. And yet, remarkably, it eludes attention for a long time. And this also relates to the fact that it took a long time for medicine and history and a history of epidemics to become part of historiography. So it's a juncture of many points in our historical awareness, in the way we change towards things. And perhaps lastly, and this is the state where memory studies is in now, memory studies in recent years, the big boom of memory studies, as you know well, Alon, in your own work you know well, has focused on trauma. Victimhood and trauma. But people are asking more and more the questions, what about recovery? Every trauma almost invariably has another story. Mm-hmm. The story of the Holocaust is also the story of the survivors. And the story of the survivors is not necessarily their story transplanted back into the camps. It's also what happened afterwards. That's part of the interview, which is rarely analyzed, what happens afterwards. We ask their stories to hear what happened then, not how you survived. And the history of recovery often includes in its repression of what happens afterwards. And that's part of the story of the flu quite clearly. People felt that they had to move on. So the story is there. What about the families that held on to the uncles? What about the pictures, which kept the picture of the member of the family who died from the flu? But there was no context to talk about this. People just moved on.
Fascinating. So we have a question from Lois Dubin from Smith College. She asked, do you see any link between the pandemic and the political and social crisis of the 1920s, 30s, such as the rise of fascism? Perhaps we can add the economic depression, crisis of democracy.
Okay. I'm going to be very careful with this answer because I'm trying to work against exactly the warning which I kind of showed you with the work of Alfred Crosby with his original title. I think people, in order to bring legitimization to this field, have had to overstress certain points. Now, the pandemic had a huge effect, obviously. Actually, economic historians can't trace its effect. They can't trace an economic effect, so it's not clear. It must have had a devastating effect economically, but economic historians haven't done the work. But then on the other hand, it's very easy to become determinist and say, well, this obviously affected many other things, and then to push it a bit too far. So we don't know. We have to tread very, very carefully, and I'd be cautious about that. I'm not saying that it didn't have effects, but we have to be very careful because there's many events that come together. On the one hand, it's been written completely outside of history, so we can explain the whole 20th century supposedly without it. So if it's that crucial, how can we miss this vital piece of the puzzle? And that's a conundrum. So maybe our ability to recover is much stronger than our ability to suffer I mean, maybe that's the real story of the 20th century. We talk of the 20th century and its great devastations. I once heard the great economic historian Yoel Mokir talk about the 5 massive blows of the 20th century which would have wiped out any society, and yet we survived them one by one. So I'm not too sure if it had lasting effects in that level. People have pointed out that it had huge demographic repercussions. It also had repercussions which are beyond the mortality. Howard Phillips talks about the unborn babies of people who were infected by influenza, about huge amounts of, that it affected demography in the world, it seems. But to read it into history, which has largely been written in political terms, I'd be very, very careful. And so we have to tread carefully on that. And interestingly enough, in terms of what we're talking about today, in terms of memory, completely missing. So even if somebody great like Studs Terkel, I looked at Studs Terkel's archive, right? The great oral historian, who many people in America know is the great man who popularized oral history in America. In all of his works, he calls attention to forgotten episodes, like the Great Depression. He called the Great Depression a forgotten episode. Was it forgotten? I doubt it. But Studs Terkel made this point when he published Hard Times, which was a pioneering book of oral testimonies. Studs Terkel, in all of his work, in all of his archives, I found a couple of references to the influenza, and he glosses over them. He doesn't make anything out of it. So it's remarkable. It's not on our radar. It tells a lot about what we consider important, not necessarily what is important.
Yeah. Another question, Guy. On your concept of pre-memory, what would you say about Albert Camus' The Plague, where the pre-memory of plague provides an allusion for the rise of fascism, which is a different sort of pre-memory?
Yeah. Well, there's 2 parts to this answer. The first part is a more general historiographical intervention. Absolutely. Our pre-memories are not just immediate events that happened before, but it's many other events which we feed into it. When I explain this to historians of World War I, for example, I say there was a pre-memory for the Great War memory. And to explain it at first, I give them an easy example. I say the Franco-Prussian War. The Franco-Prussian War is very much in the eyes of the French, and that determines their pre-memory for the Great War. And in the Germans and many others, but that's just one example. But then I tell them it doesn't have to be a real event. It could be in literature. Think of all the fantasiaca literature on imagining a future war, quite often in science fiction. The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. That is the pre-memory of the Great War. There'll be a great war which will devastate us. So you're right in looking in literature and its political interpretations. And that's crucial. But there's something else which is happening here in pre-memory which we need to look at. And this is equally important. Hey, I'm bringing you back to the flu specifically. And this relates to my notion of cultural forgetting. So we have different works of literature which engage with the epidemic, but then they're kind of glossed over and forgotten. Now, I mentioned the work of Elizabeth Utko, I think is very, very interesting. She had a book which came out just recently called Viral Modernism, highly recommended for literary scholars and beyond to look at. Elizabeth Utko makes the following point. She says, if you look at modernist literature, you'll find in all the greats of literature coded references to the epidemic that they've experienced. So it's actually all over literature. And she gives names, and I can find more names once I follow that kind of method. It's all over. It's in Yeats. It's all over. But I'm saying Yeats specifically because I'm not dealing with Irish studies, so you can find it Yeats, you can find it all the greats. So she shows Virginia Woolf, and then she moves on to one after the other, to all the greats. But the question is this. Her assumption is that people in the period would have recognized it. And that's also implicit in your own question, the question that was asked there before, that people would have recognized these notions, but we historians didn't see it. And I'm not convinced by that. I'm not convinced that for the entire century, people noticed these things and didn't talk about it. That not one cultural critic noticed in many of the great works that looked at The Wasteland by Eliot, and Utko offers a whole reading saying it's actually about flu. Maybe, but not one critic noticed it until she reads it now, which says that it's all part of cultural forgetting. We don't notice these coded references, even if they're there. And we have to be very, very careful about this. Part of cultural forgetting is exactly not attributing importance to these signs. It's about belittling it. And that's the key point of cultural forgetting. If you have a message in front of you and you don't see it, that's a form of forgetting. It's there and it's not there. It's exactly what Alon noticed in his first question. It's not about total forgetting. It's not pressing delete. It's about seeing something, but it's transparent. We see through it. And it becomes poignant at certain times, and we rediscover it at certain times, and quite often it's shelved afterwards. And that's the real warning for COVID. It's obvious to us we're all going to remember what we went through in the last year. And so everybody's been saying that. Will it? Let's wait and see. in the sense that things come and go. Histories of memory are like a sine graph. They're not a graph of forgetting, and it's not a graph of remembrance. It's never linear.
So pre-memory, Guy, if I understand you correctly, are the social and cultural symbols or images or artifacts that are part of our life with which we enter a certain historical event. We enter an historical event, we understand it through previous forms of experience and of sensibility. Now, when the event is radical, like the First World War, obviously we find that what we thought about remembrance, about heroism, is not suitable anymore. So there is a clash. But by pre-memory, you mean the symbols and images in society that inform our ideas about a certain event or a certain way society should be, with which we begin to interpret and to give meaning to a certain event, then of course it changes.
Can I respond to that, Alon?
Yeah.
Because actually I have a lot to say about that. It wasn't the topic of today. Had I given a talk on pre-memories proper, I have much more to say about it. Pre-memory, as I said, can work on a few levels. On the one hand, it's exactly what you're saying at its most basic level. It's the groundwork towards preparing memory. It's the previous scenario and schemata. We have memory scenarios for different events and we slot them in. To give an example that you would appreciate, maybe some other people in your institute, think of Chaim Yosef Yerushalmi's work on Zachor. There's Hebrew, Jewish traditions of memory. So when the next pogrom happens, they already interpret it based on their memory of previous pogroms. There's a scenario how to slot that in. That's one way. There's also another level of pre-memory, and that is how during an event we interpret it, but we also try to prepare its memory while it's happening. It's the topic of your lecture from 2 weeks ago, if you wish, of Thomas Kovan's lecture. It's our anxieties and expectations. It's every time we hear a news reporter say, this is a historical event, it'll be memorable. It's already during its time, we're preparing the memory. We're trying to influence, while an event is happening, we're trying to shape its memory in advance. Memory, as it's happening, it's already being fluid with people trying to form it. And in many cases, it doesn't work out like that later. So it also includes all the frustrations, all the anxieties, all the expectations, which are this latent moment which will appear later, below the radar, in memory discourses, in a history of memory, and a history of forgetting. Quite often these anxieties reflect forgetting. So it's not only pre-memory, it's also pre-forgetting.
Mm-hmm. More questions? You said that you don't know if the COVID-19 will be remembered, something like this. But it seems to me that we live in a different age now.
Mm-hmm.
It will certainly not be forgotten like the flu of a century ago. If by the very nature of the society in which we live, in which there are so many ways to record, but I think also because all the things that you said, both about the pre-remembrance, both about everyday life, it has a clear political intonation with Trump and others, the shock. Of course, no one knows.
Yep.
But,
well,
yeah.
Well, I mean, exactly, this is the point. The one thing we can say about certainty is it's uncertain, right? We cannot say anything certainly about what's going to happen. And that's why it's less interesting for me, that question of what's going to happen, because actually the discussion is about ourselves now. You know, I was listening to your talk from 2 weeks ago, and it was all about how people are preparing archives now for themselves in 20 years. It's not about themselves in 20 years, it's about themselves now. That was the point that was missing there. It's about our current anxieties. So on the one hand, it's clear that things will be remembered because we're auto-documenting everything. But also we're in an age where we're auto-documenting everything, and so everything is being lost because it's auto-documented. We take pictures of everything, and then it's just a picture in our phone, and we don't find them afterwards, right? Things happen one after another. So a day after something happens, the next thing happens. So the lessons that people asked me before, what you can learn from Spanish flu about that, is exactly to go back and look at how social forgetting worked and how cultural forgetting worked through a century. And there's so many lessons in that which need to be explored carefully. Let me give you some other examples from the past. I prefer to look at the past here because that's what's more interesting for me as an historian, not speculation about the future, which we can all play this party game. But I'm thinking, I'm trying to remember what's the name of the movie. I think this classic movie, the Christmas movie that everybody in America watches in Christmas that used to be played for a long time.
It's a Wonderful Day. It's a Wonderful World.
Yes, this one with the angel who comes down and helps somebody. Everybody's seen this movie many times. Even as an Israeli, I saw it, right? Have you ever noticed that it mentions Spanish flu? Next time you watch it again, you'll notice Spanish flu in it. There's a scenario there where the kid is young and he walks in and he's working in a chemist shop, and the man in the shop is suddenly has this fit because he gets the telegram of his son dying, and he stops him from committing suicide. Right? So all these things appear there in culture which were there, which we didn't notice. And that's what's remarkable, which we go back and look at. And it's remarkable to notice also how rediscovery has worked itself into contemporary popular culture. We just have to see the signs. It's all around there. I'll give another great example of rediscovery, which passed away almost unnoticed, but how all this wave of rediscovery from the 2000s and from recent years has fed into popular culture. I don't know if anybody in the audience has seen the Disney remake of Dumbo, right? Dumbo, the flying elephant. We all saw the Disney classic of its day. Disney is now making these remakes with human people, like with human characters and some combined with animation, with 3G CGI works. Watch it. Watch it just out of interest, because it actually starts with Spanish flu. It has human characters, so there's children who relate to this flying elephant, and the children are orphans. They're orphans not because of the Great War. Their father returns crippled from the Great War, but the mother dies because of Spanish flu. And this is how things come in bit by bit into popular culture. And this is quite remarkable, the story of rediscovery and when it's integrated. Now, the point that I'd like to make, and maybe I should just share my screen one last time to show you two slides that I didn't bring in, just to show them briefly, because I think you might appreciate this. I thought you wouldn't have time for it, but if we do, can everybody see the slide that I was showing before? All right, well, look at this. One of my hobbies in recent years, and this has been going on for quite a while now, is I decided I'm going to buy every book that comes out in English and in other languages, primarily in English, that mentions Spanish flu, any work of literature, right? Any novel based on Spanish flu. And for years, this was an obscure hobby. A book a year, 2 books a year. And then suddenly this began happening. Let's see if this works for us. Titles began coming out one after the other, title after title in every possible genre, from science fiction. Doctor Who has an episode on it. Science fiction, people returning in the past, bringing the virus into today and causing a terrible pandemic, to local drama stories, to fictional diaries from the time, to children's work. Here's some more, and it just goes on and on and on. Now, I mention this because I now have a collection in my office in Israel when I return of 3 sacks, massive sacks waiting for me of books bought in recent years, which I need to go through very carefully. I've only begun looking at them. So there's been a boom of interest in popular culture. But again, bringing you back to cultural memory, cultural forgetting and how it works. None of these works became canonical works. None of these works, some of them got local recognition. None of them won the Booker Prize. None of them is by a Nobel laureate. Now, this might change now. This is how I see things changing. More than anything else, I see that COVID is changing the memory of Spanish flu. It's going to become a major topic.
Guy, why is it so important that they would become canonical? If they are all over our society, maybe they are important for people, even if they are not canonical. Who said what is the canon?
I'll explain. I think they're absolutely important, and yet they have a minor readership. It's a connoisseur readership with a few people, a local readership. Many of these books can also be self-published. They reach few people. Some have minor success. If we're trying to understand, this is exactly indicative of cultural forgetting. I'm not privileging the one memory on the other. I'm observing a wider dynamic of what enters into the collective memory. Cultural forgetting is what's outside of this image. It's what historians miss. It's what literary critics miss. And yet, I think this is going to change now. I think popular culture has come to terms now in the last few months with Spanish flu. So we're going to be seeing some great works. In fact, I believe one is going to be coming out, I have advanced notice, a book which was written a couple of years ago, was written during the centenary. And now the publishers are rushing it out to get it out this month because they realize there's a new market for it. So our sensibilities are changing. And so in a way, when we're talking about pre-memory, COVID has recharged. The pre-memory of COVID has recharged the memory of Spanish flu because it plays together with it.
Maybe last question, Guy. Someone asks if you have looked at literature in languages other than English. Is the narrative there is different, say in Spain, for example, or Italy? Or maybe, especially Spain, countries that didn't participate in the Great War, perhaps?
More than that, what about countries completely around the world? I mean, this is truly a global notion. First of all, I want to make a point. And I've been thinking about this globally and transnationally. In various languages, Spanish is not only important because of Spain, it's because of Latin America and around the world. So I've been thinking about that. I've been working on that. And we had a person on the project working, Cynthia Gabay, working on literature in Latin America and comparing it with Spain. The key point about that to say is all this is a new agenda. This has hardly been done before. I had to work very, very hard to find cultural historians around the world who had begun dealing with it to ignite them to work on it. So this is just the beginning. And what about cultures which didn't have traditions of literacy? Why just look at publications of novels? So I've been looking around the world. There's many traditions. It appeared in many forms in oral traditions throughout Africa. Influenza was mentioned in many different ways. It inspired whole new religions and churches in Africa. Names, for example, Terry Ranger, the great anthropologist, remarked years ago that many people who mentioned in Rhodesia got the name Fraser, and Fraser was playing with the word influenza. Different kind of memorial traditions which have cast completely below the radar. So there's a whole work of mapping here. But again, the global picture remains more or less the same. We have this picture with various variants of social forgetting. We have local traditions, we have oral traditions, and yet they're not part of the national story of social remembering and national remembering and collective remembering. We have various cultural representations in various traditions in various forms, but they're fragmented, they're small, they're non-canonical, they pass below the radar time and time again. And then they're rediscovered and they're reignited. And that is the larger story I want you to take away from all of this, because it's a fascinating story, but it means we need to rethink how we approach memory in general. There's a much wider picture here than the pandemic. And the pandemic forces us to rethink what we mean by memory, forgetting, and rediscovery.
Guy, it was fascinating. I start to be convinced that it was not that forgotten, perhaps, or perhaps forgotten in different ways. But I have a question for you. So you started to work on this several years ago, before anyone knew that COVID-19 will come, and you predicted the future. We'd like to know what is your next project, so then we are going to be prepared for what's going to come in 4 or 5 years. You can tell us this in your next talk.
Very good, very funny. I'll just say one thing is that if there's one lesson to take from that, is that topics that seem obscure, and this is for all historians in general or watching, and any memory scholars, hold on to them if you believe in them. Because in the last month, every topic that I was working on recently, which seemed obscure, I think Vera Krijkamp is in the audience here, I saw her before. She approached me 3 months ago to write an article on destruction of monuments, which was a topic which I'm obsessed with for many years. And I said, I don't have time for it now because I need to finish this flu book. But I'll do it shortly. So destruction of monuments became a topic. And there's a series of other ones. If you have a topic and people tell you it's not a topic, work on it. History is more about fashion than about what really matters, and fashion changes very quickly.
Thank you, Guy. It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, Guy. We'll talk.
Bye-bye.